There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when someone has just heard something they cannot explain. Not the silence of boredom, not the silence of confusion, but the silence of reckoning, the silence of a mind being rearranged. That silence, according to accounts from musicians and journalists who moved through the late 1960s music circuit, was something Jimi Hendrix had a gift for producing. Not by being loud, not by performing spectacle, but by playing with such undeniable truth that whoever was listening found themselves suddenly unable to speak. This is a story about one of those moments, but it begins, as so many of the most important moments in music history do, with a challenge. In the late 1960s, a public broadcasting service documentary aired across the United States that made a quiet but seismic claim. It introduced America to Roy Buchanan, a Telecaster player from Arkansas who had spent his career largely in the shadows, backing other artists, playing club circuits, never quite becoming the name above the marquee. The documentary called him, in essence, the greatest unknown guitarist in the country. The response was immediate. Musicians who had been circling the same underground circuits for years suddenly found themselves in arguments about whether this claim was justified, overstated, or, frankly, not going far enough. Roy Buchanan was not a showman. He did not set instruments on fire. He did not play behind his head or with his teeth. He stood at the microphone with his butterscotch Fender Telecaster and he played. And what came out of that guitar was something that defied easy categorization. His tone was described by those who heard him as almost vocal, almost human, the sound of a string instrument that had somehow learned to cry. His control over feedback was not chaotic but architectural. He knew where the sound was going before it arrived there. He played with his thumb wrapped over the neck of the guitar in a technique that was all his own, producing notes that bent and swelled and collapsed in ways that no textbook had yet described. Word travels fast in the world of professional musicians, even before the age of instant communication. There were circuits, there were conversations backstage, there were tape recordings passed hand to hand. There were nights when someone would pull out a reel-to-reel after a show and say, "Listen to this, you will not believe this." According to accounts from that era, a word about Roy Buchanan and the documentary's bold claim reached Jimi Hendrix somewhere in the churn of what had become an almost unmanageable schedule. But the real question, the one that nobody quite talks about openly, is what Jimi did with that information, and more importantly, what he felt. Because here's the thing about Jimi Hendrix that the mythology tends to flatten. The mythology gives you the icon, the headband, the Stratocaster, the Woodstock feedback, the burning guitar at Monterey. The mythology gives you a man who arrived fully formed, a force of nature who simply was, who never doubted, who never measured himself against anyone else because the comparison would have been absurd. But the man behind the mythology was something considerably more complicated. Biographies and interviews from those who knew him closely describe someone who carried a persistent, almost anxious need to be understood as a musician, not simply as a spectacle. Someone who read everything written about him, who was acutely aware of what other guitarists were doing, who could be quietly destabilized by a challenge to his position, even when that position seemed, from the outside, utterly unassailable. He was, in short, human. Deeply, profoundly, vulnerably human. And that humanity is what makes the story of Roy Buchanan matter. It was sometime in the later months of the 1960s when the Jimi Hendrix Experience was operating at the highest altitude of its cultural reach. The band had already released 3 studio albums. Are You Experienced? Axis, Bold as Love, and Electric Ladyland had between them redrawn the map of what electric guitar music could be, could sound like, could mean. Radio stations that had once been cautious about Jimi's music were now playing it without hesitation. Concert halls were too small. Journalists were running out of new ways to describe what he did. The word genius had been used so many times it was beginning to lose its shape. And yet, inside that enormous public success, something was restless. Those close to Jimi during this period describe a growing tension between what the industry wanted from him and what he wanted from himself. The experience was a phenomenon, but Jimi was already hearing something else in his head, something more expansive, more rhythmically complex, more connected to the deeper roots of American music that had formed him long before London and long before stardom. He was spending longer hours in studios, not because the music required more takes, but because he was searching for something that he could not yet fully articulate. He would work through a song 40, 50 times, adjusting a note here, a texture there, listening to the space between sounds with the concentration of a man trying to decipher a language he almost understood. This is the Jimi who heard about Roy Buchanan, not the icon, the searcher. According to accounts pieced together from musicians and industry figures of the period, Jimi managed to track down a performance or recording of a performance by Roy Buchanan during this time. The details of exactly how and when vary depending on who is telling the story. What does not vary is the description of Jimi's response. He sat and he listened, and then he sat some more. He did not immediately reach for his guitar. He did not immediately have anything to say. There is a particular quality to that kind of silence. It is the silence of someone who has just encountered something that requires reorganization. Not the reorganization of a single idea, but of a framework, of a way of understanding what the instrument can do and what he himself is doing with it. Roy Buchanan played the Telecaster with a directness that was almost confrontational. There were no effects pedals layering his sound into something unrecognizable. There was no wall of amplification creating an atmosphere that the guitar could hide inside. There was just the string, the pickup, and the hand. And whatever that combination produced was naked in the most complete sense of the word. Every choice was visible. Every decision about where to place a note, how long to hold it, when to let it go and when to force it further, was audible in a way that left nowhere to retreat. This directness was not something Jimi lacked, but it was something that lived in his playing alongside other elements. The psychedelic architecture, the studio experimentation, the performance, the theater, the spectacle that had become, whether he chose it or not, part of what audiences expected and what critics measured. Roy Buchanan existed in a world with none of those additional layers. He was just a man and a guitar, playing with a purity that was, in its own way, a form of accusation, not aimed at Jimi personally, aimed at everything that could come between a musician and his instrument. What Jimi reportedly said after listening, and accounts differ slightly on the exact wording, was something that suggested he respected Buchanan deeply, that the playing was real in a way that was not common, that there was something in the tone, in the control, in the economy of the playing, that deserved genuine acknowledgement rather than competitive dismissal. But there was something else underneath that acknowledgement, something that could not quite be named but that people around him, those who saw him in the days that followed, recognized in his behavior. A renewed urgency, a recalibration, because what Jimi reportedly played the following night on stage was different, not radically, not in a way that the average audience member would have been able to identify as a response to something he had heard, but different in a way that the musicians who were paying close attention noticed. There was something stripped back in the early part of the set, something that reached for directness before building toward complexity, something that felt like a conversation being conducted with someone who was not in the room. This is the part of the story that most histories skip over. They want the competition. They want the rivalry. They want the moment where Jimi plays something definitive and Roy Buchanan is left behind, or where Buchanan reveals something that humbles the great man and forces him to reckon with his limitations. Music journalism and music mythology more broadly tends to love those clean narrative shapes. But the reality of how great musicians respond to each other is almost never that clean. It is rarely competitive in the way that sports is competitive, where one outcome erases the other. More often, it is dialogic. One voice hears another voice and begins to change in response, not to surpass it, not to defeat it, but to absorb something from it and fold that something into an ongoing conversation that was already in progress. Roy Buchanan was saying something to the American music world in those years. He was saying that technical brilliance without commercial machinery could still find an audience. He was saying that the Telecaster, which the rock world had largely associated with country music and straightforward blues, contained multitudes that had not yet been explored. He was saying that a guitarist could work at the deepest level of the form without becoming famous, and that this fact said something complicated about the relationship between greatness and recognition. Jimi heard that. On whatever level musicians hear each other, he heard it. And this is where the story becomes something more than a footnote in either man's biography. Jimi Hendrix had arrived in the public consciousness through London, through the experience, through a series of performances and recordings that presented him as something new, something unprecedented. And he was. But what gets lost in that framing is where he came from before London. He had spent years on the Chitlin Circuit, the network of performance venues across the American South and Midwest where black performers could work during the era of segregation. He had backed soul and rhythm and blues artists, learned to play for dancers, learned the discipline of serving a groove rather than dominating it. He had been, before he was a phenomenon, a sideman, a hired hand who could play anything and who was paid to play what the bandleader needed rather than what he himself heard in his head. Roy Buchanan had a version of that same history. Not the Chitlin Circuit specifically, but the experience of working as a sideman, of being the best musician in the room and being invisible because the room was not organized around musicians like him. There was a shared grammar between them, a shared understanding of what it meant to be a certain kind of guitarist in an industry that was rarely organized to see or hear you clearly. When Jimi encountered Buchanan's playing, he was in some sense encountering a version of a road not taken, a version of a musical life organized entirely around the purity of the playing, without the platform, without the mythology, without the machinery. And that version was, by the measure of pure musicianship, extraordinary. What does a man do when he encounters a mirror that shows him something he did not know was there? In Jimi's case, the answer seems to have been that he went back to work, not in a reactive or panicked way, but with a kind of renewed attention to the things that mattered most to him underneath all of the noise and expectation: the tone, the note choice, the relationship between what he played and what he did not play, the silence as much as the sound. Musicians who worked with him in recording sessions during this period describe someone who was becoming more precise, not in a technical sense only, but in an intentional sense. More deliberate about what he was reaching for, more willing to discard a take not because it was technically flawed, but because it did not yet say the thing he was trying to say. More committed to a kind of honest relationship with the instrument that had nothing to do with impressing anyone and everything to do with truth. There is a quality in the recordings from the later period of Jimi's work that biographers and musicologists have noted, a quality that is hard to name, but that is palpable when you listen carefully. A quality of searching that is also, simultaneously, a quality of arriving. As if the music is in the process of becoming itself, rather than performing being something it has already decided to be. Roy Buchanan, who would eventually receive a degree of wider recognition in the 1970s through a series of albums for Polydor Records, never became a household name in the way that Jimi Hendrix did. He continued to play with the same ferocious purity throughout his career, developing a small but intensely dedicated following that included a significant number of professional musicians who regarded him as one of the most important guitarists of his generation. His influence on subsequent generations of players has been substantial, though it has operated largely through the underground channel of musicians talking to musicians rather than through mainstream cultural recognition. Oh, but there is a particular irony in the trajectory of these two men's legacies that deserves acknowledgement. Roy Buchanan was celebrated by that public broadcasting service documentary and by those who followed him closely, precisely for being unknown. The greatness and the obscurity were presented as somehow linked, as if the industry's failure to recognize him was itself evidence of an authenticity that more recognized artists lacked. Jimi had the opposite problem. He was so recognized, so thoroughly claimed by the culture as a symbol of a particular moment and a particular kind of revolutionary energy, that the actual musician underneath the symbol became harder and harder to see. The man who listened to Roy Buchanan and felt something shift, the man who went back to his instrument and tried to hear himself more clearly, that man was less visible than the icon. What would it have meant for these two musicians to have played together? The question has been raised by music historians, by guitarists who knew both men, by people who understand the particular kind of conversation that happens when two musicians of that caliber are in the same room with instruments in their hands. There is no record of such a meeting. There is no documented session, no surviving recording, no eyewitness account that describes the two of them playing together. What there is, instead, is the music that each of them made in the years during which they were both active. And what that music suggests, when you listen to it with the question of their potential dialogue in mind, is that they were already in conversation, even without meeting, yet that the music itself was exchanging ideas across the distance between them, across the difference in their public profiles, across the gap between the recognized and the unrecognized, finding common ground in the thing that had always mattered most to both of them, the guitar and what it could say when you stopped performing and started listening. The night that Jimi reportedly played differently after hearing Buchanan was not a capitulation. It was not an admission that Buchanan was better or that Jimi's approach had been wrong. It was something quieter and more interesting than that. It was a conversation. It was one great musician hearing another great musician and allowing that hearing to change something in himself, however slightly, however invisibly, to the audience watching. This is how music actually progresses. Not through grand gestures or competitive performances designed to establish supremacy. Through these quiet, invisible moments of listening that change a player's internal compass by a degree or two, and, over time, those small adjustments compound into something that nobody could have predicted and everybody can hear. Jimi Hendrix died in September 1970. He was 27 years old. He had been famous for approximately 3 years. The catalog he left behind was 3 studio albums and a handful of live recordings that have been studied, analyzed, and argued over ever since. Roy Buchanan outlived him by nearly 2 decades, continuing to play and record until his own death in 1988. The question of who was the greatest guitarist, the question that the Public Broadcasting Service documentary posed and that reportedly reached Jimi's ears, is ultimately not a question that music can answer. Greatness in music is not a fixed point that one player occupies and another cannot. It is a conversation, a direction, a way of listening and responding and reaching toward something that keeps moving as you approach it. What the story of Jimi and Roy Buchanan illustrates, perhaps more than anything else, is that the greatest musicians know this. They know that the title is not the point. They know that whoever holds it this week will hand it on to someone else next week, and that this is not a failure but the nature of the form. They know that the real conversation is not about who is best, but about what music can become when someone listens deeply enough to hear what it is asking for. And they know, in the way that only musicians can know, that hearing that clearly, a hearing past the ego and the expectation and the mythology, is the hardest thing of all. It is the work of a lifetime. It does not end with recognition. It does not end with fame. Sometimes, if you are lucky, it does not end at all. What Jimi took from hearing Roy Buchanan, or what those who watched him in the days afterward believed he took, was not a lesson in humility in any simple sense. It was a reminder of something he had always known, something that had been in the music since the beginning but that the machinery of stardom could obscure, that the guitar is honest when the player is honest, that the instrument hears you before the audience does, that the most important listener in the room is always the one holding the neck. The silence that falls after music like that is not empty. It is full of everything that just happened and everything that is about to change. It is the sound of someone deciding, quietly and without announcement, to go back to the beginning and try again. And sometimes that is where the most important work gets done. Not on the stage, not in the documentary, not in the title, in the quiet room afterward, with the guitar in your hands and the memory of something you just heard still rearranging the furniture of your understanding. That is where Jimi Hendrix went. That is what Roy Buchanan, without intending to, without knowing it, sent him back to. And that is why the story matters, long after both men are gone, and the guitars they played are in museums, and the music they made is still, every day, teaching someone something they did not know they needed to know.